This history shows us many things, and we have many sources by which to show that these events occurred. The entire archaeological record is on board with these events. None of this is fictional, none of it's made up, none of it's unusual. Well, some of it is kind of unusual, but it's all enmeshed together in beautiful numbers as well. It's a construct. If it happened according to fixed principles, or if it's all invented and it's an arithmetic construct that we have put together, doesn't matter. All that matters is we're in the here and now, and something is giving us this to study, which basically implies there's something to learn. So by all means, let's get into this study after I drink this water. Okay. Last look at my little comments right here before I deep dive. Okay, lower class citizen, how you doing? All right, guys. Before I begin with the year 1400, let's put this in proper perspective, because this is the year 2022. So we're talking about 622 years ago. But even more so, we're talking about a world that is just recovering from something that occurred that was so hellish that the history books are very scant about it. And yet we know from the records of the time that it was ubiquitous. We know that in 1400, the world was just waking up from the greatest murder spree that had ever happened among the human, basically the human race. Nothing like this had ever happened. In the year 1347 AD, at least one third of the entire world's population was completely decimated in a weird plague that caused blue and purple lesions on people's body. Their lymph nodes swelled, their skin turned purple, and their veins began to pop out, and it took a long time to die. There was no recovery. If you got it, you died. It's called the bubonic plague by historians. It may have been something far worse. The historian, I have a video about this that you guys can go watch. It's in that first 100 video series. The historians of the time do not tell us that rats came from ships from the east. They didn't tell us that at all. That's a modern interpretation by the establishment. What the historians of the day tell us is that cigar-shaped objects appeared in the sky. Some of them sprayed a mist, and it caused people to get sick, fall down, and die. Other cigar shapes opened up their bellies and dumped decayed and mutilated animal body parts in the forest, and from the stench, the plague was born. The establishment doesn't talk about these historical records. My video goes to the sources and to the authors in the last 20 and 30 years who he also wrote about this episode. It's the Great Black Death. Our story here begins as the world is waking back up. 52 years later, the world is now waking back up, and 53, 54 years later, the world's waking back up, just getting started. And during this period, the Christian world, the European world, is not doing good at all. They have survived the attacks of the Khans, although at great decimation. One of the last, Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame, we know him as Tamerlane. These great genocidal chieftains that just brought destruction everywhere they went. Those episodes were over, and a new enemy entered the European theater. It was the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. to be more precise. They became the new plague of Europe. This Muslim invasion followed the Muslim invasions of centuries earlier that finally Charles Martel of France, the Franks, had defeated. Now, what puts this into perspective is if you go through my Chronicon, you will see detailed historical records of all the centuries that all this was going on. Much of the material of the Tartaria narrative comes from these periods. There was invasions of foreigners, but those foreigners didn't bring engineers and architects. They used local ones. However, they forced the local Gothic and basically the artisans of the day in Europe to employ the foreign basically art, the aesthetics. This is why the buildings are so fundamentally different than what other European time periods produced. So we have these massive Khan invasions and all their foreign engineers that they had brought in and the local ones that they had forced to work. And then they dissipate. Then the Muslim invasions. Then following the Muslims invasions, we have the Turkish, the Ottoman Empire, also Islamic. They come in. This is the background to our story. At this time, people used to go to sleep. I mean, before they went to bed at night, they used to pray to God to deliver them from the comets, from the plague, and from the Turks. This was a very common prayer all throughout Europe during this period. People feared three things: the comets, because they were happening, and evil things were occurring on Earth when they did. They feared the comets, they feared the plague, and they feared the Turk. So anyway, this isn't me making it up. This comes from the historical record. This is a very common prayer. Now, let's see. Starting at 1400, as the world is waking up, in the year 1400, a large piece of metal fell out the sky and landed in Bohemia. That's nothing that I should normally tell you guys about. However, it landed in Bohemia, which is where our story begins. By the time most of it had burned up, when the Bohemians uncovered the piece of metal that fell from the sky, it was still 235 pounds. Now, 1400 is in the middle of the burning times. The burning times were harrowing because the Roman Catholic Church had come up with a plan to disenfranchise many people from their wealth, and they did it in two ways. They sent all these men to go fight in the Crusades against the Muslims, knowing many of them wouldn't come back. When they received news that the men had died on Muslim battlefields, they trumped up charges of witchcraft against the females that were still holding down the manors, the castles, all the lands. And in this way, the Roman Catholic Church didn't have to pay the men that had died on the battlefield. They didn't have to pay into their estate. And they turned around because the church had already created new laws, new papal bulls and edicts declaring that any household where the owner of the house or the inheritor of the house was to be accused of witchcraft and be found guilty, all their rights and possessions was forfeited to the church. The burning times saw an innumerable amount, but 99.9% of them were female. There were a few males in there, but these women had done no wrong. About 99% of them weren't even witches. They were landowners. They owned cattle. They owned things the Roman Catholic Church wanted. Some of those women actually survived the torture to be burned at the stake. Most of them were on the verge of death by the time they were burned. Some of them were burned alive. Others, like I said, were already dying as they were being born. They had been starving, put in dungeons. The Roman Catholics, they basically, it's murder. It's just hundreds of years of murder is what it was. This was done by Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, and the clergy. So this is the background to this amazing story that you guys have received from Hollywood as Dracula. I'm telling you now, the story of Vlad the Impaler is far deeper. So, for the year 1400. So in 1401, we have Tamer the Lame. His capital was Samarkand. Again, this is a major Hollywood theme. Comes from old fiction and old books. So, Samarkand was the ancient land, the old kingdom that Conan the Barbarian was always roaming around. That was Samarkand. Okay. Now, the cons, contrary to popular belief, you got to understand what you read in the history books. A lot of it is such BS. It's such BS. Let me cite an ancient author who describes what Tamerlane actually looked like. This is a Mongol leader, one of the last of the Khans. The Arabian Muslim writer Ahmed ibn Arab Shah describes Timur as mighty in strength, with a long beard, very tall, white in color, lame on his right side, powerful in voice, brave, and absolutely fearless. This was a Khan. Now, 1402. Two comets appeared over Europe in the year 1402. Jabocus Angelus of Ulm, Germany, or Norway, one of them, somewhere in Europe. He wrote about these two comets that appeared. Nothing unusual happened other than that, but you got to understand, we're emerging out of the Dark Ages into the Middle Ages. Well, we're in the Middle Ages, but the Middle Ages had a setback. The Middle Ages were already in full swing, and then as this great period of Enlightenment was just starting to go out, all of a sudden the Nemesis X object appears in 1314 and begins all kinds of hell. It's a great black darkness that obscured the stars in the year 1314. It was followed by the Great Black Death Plague. So, (1404). Not the entire world is not dark. In 1404, the Chinese put together 5,000 pages of encyclopedia covering 4,000 years of Chinese history, discoveries, the arts, the rulers, the dynasties. The Chinese in 1404 began putting together just the magnum opus of China. China was going through an Enlightenment period. So this remember, we're now a full generation, like 45, 50 years after 1/3 of the entire world's population has died. So this was China. Oh, I'm sorry. It's a 4,000 volume encyclopedia. It's a library. That's what it is. Here's where our story begins. It begins in the year 1408. Societas Draconis begins. It is the Order of the Dragon, or the Order of the Society of the Dragon. Now, this is a secretive society that actually goes back even farther, but it was resurrected in Romania, right here in the year 1408. Well, actually in Hungary. It ended up going to Romania, but it was resurrected in Hungary, not far, by Sigismund von Luxemburg. Now, my note here from the book The Dragon Legacy, page 22, says the Order of the Dragon was essentially reborn. It is an ancient fraternity, and it was the only members are nobility and kings. So, dukes and barons and earls and stuff like that. Society's Dragon. Interestingly, this is the year 1332 of the Saka calendar. The Saka calendar represents a Indo-Aryan people that had established a timekeeping system in India. It is the year 666 plus 666 Saka reckoning. This is when the Order of the Dragon calendar began, 1408 AD. In 1409, the Chinese navigator Ching Ho took the largest fleet China had ever put together and sailed around Ceylon into the Indian Ocean. At several places throughout the coastlines of Southeast Asia, the Chinese erected commemorative pillars with Chinese describing this major voyage. In Chinese, Tamil, and Persian. The Chinese imperial policy was to parade the wealth of the empire and exhibit its magnificence rather than dominate over its subjects. Do you see something interesting here? The Chinese spent their wealth and built a fleet of 500-something ships that contained museums that China wanted to show off to all these other Asian nations, to show them, look, floating museums, floating zoos, floating military garrisons, to show off the wealth of China. But the Chinese, although they could, didn't invade any of their neighbors. One of the animals was a giraffe. I thought that was pretty interesting. But in 1409, we have another significant development in Asia. We have historical records showing that Gutenberg or Gutenberg, whatever his name was, did not invent the printing press. Coster of Haarlem invented the printing press for the Europeans. But even that isn't a true inception, because we now have records that print blocks were first used in Korea as early as 1409. So in 1415 AD, we have John Huss. We need to discuss John Huss before we get to Vlad. John Huss of Bohemia was a scholar priest from Prague, a moral reformer. He was totally against the Roman Catholic Church's practice of keeping the Bible away from the common people. I know a lot of you have a problem understanding that, but it was only in the 1700s that it became popular for common people to even be allowed to open up and read a Bible. Wycliffe started it, but it didn't become popular until the late 1700s, like 1776. Until then, only clergy read Bibles, and the Roman Catholic Church was dead against any Protestant Bibles being read by the common people. So, John Huss of Bohemia was against that. And he did something that the Roman Church could not forgive him for. He translated the Bible into his own native language. And the Bohemians loved him ever since. So the papacy, they declared John Huss a heretic, and they condemned him. And many of John Huss's friends and colleagues and family had told him, do not go to Rome, they will kill you. At the time, Rome was busy burning women and taking all their properties. But they had time to burn John Huss too, and they told him, you need to stay away, you need to stay away. So, unfortunately, this is one of the periods of history where we really get to see the inside of the Vatican for what it is. They issued a public declaration to John Huss that he would have protection. He would have an immunity if he would just come to Rome and discuss this matter. John Huss went. He knew he was going to die. I think he knew. John Huss went The people of Bohemia were devastated. They didn't want him to go. They were really devastated when John Huss was arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake. That was unforgivable, and the Roman Catholic Church had no idea just how much they were about to lose behind doing that. This is the story of the Bohemians, the Hussites, is what they later called themselves, and the Vatican. It began in 1415 AD. Vlad the Impaler was already alive, and we'll get to him. Make sure I'm looking at the chat thread real quick to make sure my audio's still good. I'd hate to think I was doing something dumb. Just anybody. Tell me I'm good on chat. Okay, mister, thank you. Loud and clear. Lower class, good. Okay. So, pull that out. Get this up. So, anybody can verify this history. I'm not making it. This is all in Chronicon. For those of you who don't have access to Chronicon, it's in Gumroad links below. This is Chronicon. I told you guys I can literally do hundreds of videos out of Chronicon, not even counting all my unpublished notes. Chronicon is packed. We can do a mathematical analysis of all of this in another video. Right now, I just want to get the details out. The Bohemians were pissed. So there was a full-scale insurrection. No more money was going to Rome from Bohemia. The Vatican put a papal army together, invaded Bohemia, and got their asses kicked bad. So bad that other European nations were indignant about how badly that the papal army had been defeated. A multinational confederation of armies all came together under papal flags, and Vatican sent more mercenaries. This massive invasion invaded Bohemia, and the Hussites, still enraged that their holy man that brought their nation the Bible had been lied to and had been thank you, Roland, had been lied to and burned at the stake. They felt the entire nation had been disrespected. They took their wagons and they took their farm wagons and they turned them into war wagons. They took their tools. They were not a military nation. They took their tools, farming tools, hunting weapons, and they forged themselves into an army in Bohemia. In a series of battles, this small group of Hussites, the Bohemians, they were basically filled with a righteous indignation and a belief that God was on their side. And they beat the shit out of every single army that invaded Bohemia, even the Confederation, all the mercenaries of Rome, and sent them running. This is in the historical record. This is one of the amazing feats of early Europe, 1400s. So, called the Hussites. Now, this was the second time. Rome has a problem with ego. The Pope wasn't going to take an ass whooping. He did not care how many other Europeans died because he and the cardinals were not fighting. So he sent a third collection of armies that was even bigger, summed up. Now he's emptying Vatican coffers to pay for armies. Some kings and queens told him no. No, we're not sending our army to Bohemia. We're not doing that. Finally, after about a year, he amassed such a huge, massive invasion force. But the Bohemians had already had two major victories. And they were still smarting over the fact that their hero had been dealt so treacherously with. The third invasion, again, the Hussites prevailed. The Bohemians were now feared all across Europe. No one wanted to mess with the Bohemians. So we have the situation unfolding over a period of years. Rome waited 2 or 3 years, amassed another major invasion force, and again invaded a 4th time, then did it again a 5th time. And guess what? Rome never again invaded the Hussites. The Bohemians won all 5 wars. That's all. It's awesome. It's awesome. But what does it tell us today? Well, it should answer for several of you who have asked me in emails and in the comments sections. You have asked this. Many of you asked the same question about the elite always having control. Have the elite always been in control? Or what's the point of any type of resistance if the elite have always been in control? Well, you're asking me a question based off a false premise. I have never seen evidence in Chronicon, in my historical studies, that the elite have always been in control. I've seen just the opposite. I have seen major forces contending with each other. In this instance, it was the Hussites, full of spiritual Christian rage against a spiritual oppressor, the Vatican. And they won all 5 times. But that doesn't put the Hussites on one side and the Vatican on the other. The Vatican is but an arm of what we call today the deep state. But the deep state is a consortium of families. It's a consortium of basically the elite. There is an opposition. My problem is I'm not going to sit here in this studio and try to convince you guys that there is a whole nother collection of human families that are opposed to them. And this is why we get these weird things happening in history. All throughout history, these major things are developing. They're going to go a certain way. All of a sudden, something breaks them. No. My view and my historical vantage point is very different. There is opposition. I do not believe it is human. But I do believe that it requires human agency to manifest. That's a big difference. So, the Vatican met with opposition quick, too. All right. Here's something interesting in 1417. Let's see. Look at I don't want to leave anybody behind. All right. Now, 1417, France and Spain, followed by other European nations, held a council. It was called the Council of Pisa. Y'all know the Leaning Tower of Pisa? That's what it's talking about. In this council, several European nations came together to affirm that Christianity was of very high antiquity in Britain. They also determined in this year of 1417 that Christianity, not only was Christianity ancient, but it was first found in Britain, but also that ancient Britain was the first nation to adopt the gospel. That's very interesting. Now, for those of you who have read my Chronicon, you will understand that much of the Old Testament history did unfold very, very interesting, the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and many of the developments of Paul's life after he left the Middle East are found only in the British Isles. So why Paul felt it necessary after he basically laid down the cornerstones of the Christian faith, having adopted much of the Gnostic tenets, he left the Middle East. He left the Mediterranean, and he appeared in the historical record in ancient Britain. But he didn't just choose Britain for any reason. It's who was already in Britain and what his message was about. Now, all this is in Chronicon, but it's not the subject matter of this video. We might get into it in another one. But it has everything to do with the Stone of Scone. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. The Stone of Destiny. All right. In the year 1419, the Chinese finally complete the 4,000 volume Encyclopedia of Chinese History. Man, I would love to read that. I don't even know if I could read that in my entire lifetime. 4,000 volumes of Chinese history? Oh my God. I would love to read that. Man, it's terrible. In the year 1420, there goes the papacy. The papacy's declaring war against Bohemia again. And at the exact same time, 1420, in both Lyons, in Lyons, France, and from Austria, the Jews are run out of both countries for financial malpractices. They run them completely out of both of those countries. Now, the church made a major push in 1420. They had declared by edict that, well, let me read it right here. I don't want to misquote this. Rome sought to end the idea of individual peoples possessing copies of the Bible in their own languages. Rome only approved Latin translations of the scriptures and only to be read by priests on certain days of the year, and only certain passages were to be read. That sounds like censorship to me. You're only going to read me 2 or 3 verses each time we get together 3 times a year? And I'll never be able to know if those verses really say that, and I won't get to see the other 99.999999% of the Bible. That sounds like the Pope to me. All right. The papacy was so pissed that they even filed a former edict declaring that John Huss was guilty. They're trying to justify murdering the man, lying to him, giving him safe passage, revoking it, torturing him, and burning him at the stake. So, yeah, it's crazy. The hero of the Hussites was John Zizka. John Zizka was a veteran. He had one eye. And the people loved him. He was an ex-knight. And he's the one that got all the people to take their wagon and fruit and vegetable carts and to put them and turn them into war wagons. So now, we say war wagons because that's what the historical record is talking about. But the descriptions these war wagons have, we're talking about the Bohemians being the very first in modern history to invent tank warfare. Because that's what they did. They probably rolled those wagons heavily armored with weapons hanging out all over them straight into the crowds of the oncoming invaders. Now, General Zizka called his men the warriors of God. He defeated Emperor Sigismund and the Pope several times. Really good book put out. It's a really good book that describes his whole history in detail, because I'm not going in detail in this video just on John Huss. We're going to get to Vlad. The book is called Huss the Heretic. It might be a 110, 120-year-old book, but it's called Huss the Heretic, and it's put out by Booktree. If anybody wants that book, it's probably like $12, $13. Really, really good history. I love those old books. So, but the reprint you can get in paperback pretty cheap from Booktree. That's a 1-800-700-TREE. You can call Paul Tyson and get that book. All right. So, in 1421, Emperor Sigismund retreated with a much depleted army. But 2 more papal armies invaded Bohemia, totaling 100,000 men. General Zizka led the Bohemians in a stunning series of victories, sending both armies fleeing out of Bohemia. That is just crazy. And this year, 1421, was also the 52nd year of the Ming Dynasty that overthrew the Mongols. In this year, the Forbidden City in China was finished. On February 2nd, the Chinese New Year. Thank you, Harley. For those of you who don't know, although I know my Aussie listeners know this, but for those of you who don't know, the Chinese, those gigantic fleets that used to go show off their zoos and their floating museums and their garrisons to all these other Asian nations. One of those massive, gigantic fleets somehow ended up in Australia. Yeah, that's in the historical record. And that would have been about 23 centuries after the Egyptian fleet that was lost wound up in Australia. How are these massive giant fleets just all of a sudden disappearing from the continents, the continental seas over here, and reappearing in Australia? How's that happening? In 1424, the Jews are expelled from Cologne. And General John Zizka of the Bohemian army, he dies from the plague. He instructs his men to take his skin and make a war drum. After he died, they made a war drum. And the warriors of God, the Bohemians, never lost a battle after that, because every time they entered into a conflict, they beat on the war drum of John Zizka. Pretty gruesome back then, but we haven't even got to gruesome yet. That's what this video is about. Even before we get to Vlad the Impaler, you're going to read some gruesome. You're going to hear some gruesome stuff. That was John Zizka and the Hussites. So we're moving forward in time now, man. A fourth crusade against the Hussites of Bohemia was assembled from all the papal countries of Europe. There was 100% participation across Europe, as all by this time feared the Pope. The invasion was initiated behind the news of John Zizka's death. This massive army invaded Bohemia, and to the amazement of all of Europe, it was crushed by the Bohemians, who fought furiously to the beat of Zizka's war drum, which, according to reports, issued an incredibly deafening noise. The papal army fled into Germany, and parts of Germany then fell to Bohemia. Yeah, you guys got to read that book, Huss the Heretic. It's fantastic, it really is. All right, guys, we're moving into 1428. One of my favorite personalities from history. In 1488, some of you know him, Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator of Portugal, he brought back from Venice, Italy, a map of the world that showed South America and the continents of the world. This is in 1428. Now, Portugal actually means Port of the Gauls, for those of you who don't know. All right. Now, there's a lot of speculation that the Venice map, according to now this is an expert, Gavin Menzies. According to Gavin Menzies, the Venice map that shows the distribution of the continents and South America was a map made by the Chinese that had come into Portuguese hands. That's pretty interesting. And for those of you who don't know, Henry the Navigator was Knights Templar behind the scenes. Knights Templar officially were gone. They were officially gone. But unofficially, they were now basically highly opposed to all the papal, I keep seeing that flash, but somebody else told me what it might be, having another app open at the same time that I'm running a video. So I'm going to close this Word file. That was just my announcements, different things I need help with. Maybe it'll stop. I don't know. Thank you guys for the donations. You know I'm going to put them. Hey, Wendy Flores, look at that little blue wrench. I bet you didn't know, Wendy. Back a year and a half ago, when you were asking me every question in the world, man, that you'd actually be a moderator one day. Isn't that something? All right. Now, I know some of you women know that we're getting real close to a date that you guys, you females, know pretty well. So, again, the Roman papal armies, the Hussites, they defeated, they get their asses kicked by the Hussites again. All together. Let's read. I want to quote this. I want to quote this. I don't want to misquote this. The papacy in Rome unsuccessfully launched multinational armies 9 times against Bohemia, simply because they asserted their divine right to read the Holy Scriptures in their own language, a seed planted by the reformer John Huss. You didn't invade those people to take their stuff. You didn't invade those people because they were doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. The Roman Catholic Church. Yeah, the Roman Catholic Church. Something very powerful even today. The papacy, the Vatican, they did that. They did that. And they were doing that at the same time that papal agents were raping women all over Europe and then shutting them up by putting them in these dungeons that the historians they basically turned it into a euphemism. They call them nunneries. No. So, at the same time in history, 1431, on May 30th, these sorry bastards burned Joan of Arc at the stake alive. Y'all know the story of Joan of Arc. Same time. Here we got 2 major historical personalities here. Really 4. John Zizka, for the time, was super. He was super popular. John Huss, super popular, man. I mean, he started a whole movement. And then Joan of Arc. We all know the story of Joan of Arc. She was the hero. But then when she was no longer needed, they burned her at the stake. It's no good. Yeah, the Roman Church and Britain feared her influence and despised her role in the liberation of France because she was a female. That she eventually married Sieur de Armois of Metz, even having a family together, has long been a theory that they burned somebody else and it wasn't Joan of Arc. Kind of hard, though, with so many people knowing what she looked like while she was on that pyre. It's kind of hard to believe that one. Whatever. Now, I've told you guys many times, I have shown you, I have demonstrated in my videos that when people that are very famous in the historical record die, someone very famous in the historical record is also born. We have the same thing happening now. We have Joan of Arc. John Zizka died a couple years earlier, but Joan of Arc died in 1431. But in 1431, Vlad the Impaler was born. So now we're gonna get into Vlad. Now you need to go listen to my Nostradamus videos, and I show you how that happens. Mother Shipton dies, Francis Bacon, as Mother Shipton, Francis Bacon, Nostradamus, Prometheus, how all these lives and births, it's just fantastic. Yeah, there's definitely a rhythm into the ways of the holosphere. This is not random at all. So, Joan of Arc dies, Vlad the Impaler is born. In 1433, 2 years later, a comet is seen over Europe and recorded by Piero Toscanelli, who recorded its exact position